The year is 2023. A sophisticated criminal network operating across 3 continents believes they've discovered the perfect scheme. Using techniques they think are cutting edge, they're producing counterfeit currency that looks flawless to the untrained eye. Their leader, a man who studied the great deceptions of history, is convinced they've cracked a code that will make them wealthy beyond measure. Within 6 months, every single member of this network will be in custody. Their downfall won't come from informants or surveillance technology. Instead, they'll be undone by a security flaw first exploited 80 years ago, during the darkest days of the Second World War. A flaw they never knew existed, a trap set decades before they were born. This is the story of Operation Bernhard, the most ambitious counterfeiting scheme ever attempted, and how the lessons learned from it continue to ensnare criminals who think they understand the art of deception. It's a tale that spans from the concentration camps of Nazi Germany to the boardrooms of modern central banks, from desperate prisoners forced to become master forgers to today's tech-savvy criminals who believe they're smarter than history itself. But most importantly, it's the story of a security principle so fundamental yet so frequently forgotten that it continues to catch the overconfident and the underprepared, generation after generation. To understand how a wartime operation still haunts modern criminals, we need to go back to 1942. Europe is engulfed in total war. The German Reich controls most of the continent, from the Atlantic coast of France to the outskirts of Moscow. Britain stands defiant but besieged, dependent on supply lines across the Atlantic that are being savaged by German submarines. In Berlin, the leadership of the Third Reich is considering unconventional weapons, not just the rockets and jets being developed by their engineers, but economic weapons, financial warfare on a scale never before attempted. The concept is devastatingly simple. If you can't defeat an enemy through military might alone, destroy their economy, flood their nation with perfect counterfeit currency, so much that their money becomes worthless. Watch as inflation spirals out of control, as citizens lose faith in their government's ability to maintain order, as the very foundation of commerce collapses. The target is Britain. The weapon is the pound sterling. The man chosen to lead this operation is Major Bernhard Kruger, an officer in the SS. Kruger is not a typical SS officer. He's a police detective by training, methodical and detail-oriented. He understands that counterfeiting isn't just about printing money. It's about replicating an entire system of security measures, some visible, many invisible. Kruger is given essentially unlimited resources and a mandate that chills the blood. He's to use prisoners from the concentration camps. Specifically, he's to find the best engravers, printers, artists, and technicians among the imprisoned populations and put them to work creating perfect British pounds. The prisoners selected for this operation face an impossible moral calculation. Refuse, and they'll likely be sent to their end in the gas chambers. Cooperate, and they might survive, but at the cost of helping the regime that's trying to destroy them and their people. In early 1943, the first prisoners arrive at a special barracks in Sachsenhausen concentration camp, just north of Berlin. Among them is Adolf Berger, a Slovak typographer. There's Salomon Smolyanov, a Russian-born artist and forger who had already served time for counterfeiting before the war. There's Adolf Berger, a Czech printer who had been arrested for producing false documents to help people escape persecution. These men and dozens like them find themselves in a surreal situation. While tens of thousands in the camps around them are worked to the point of complete exhaustion or worse, they're given decent food, allowed to sleep on real beds, and provided with the finest printing equipment money can buy. Their workshop is a mockery of normalcy in the heart of an extermination system. But make no mistake, they're still prisoners, still under constant threat, still aware that their usefulness is the only thing keeping them alive. The challenge Kruger sets before them seems insurmountable. The Bank of England, by 1943, has been printing currency for over 250 years. Their banknotes incorporate security features developed over generations. Some of these features are public knowledge. Others are closely guarded secrets. The paper itself is the first obstacle. British pounds aren't printed on ordinary paper. They're printed on a specific blend that includes linen fibers, giving the notes their distinctive feel. The prisoners have to analyze genuine pounds, fiber by fiber, chemical by chemical, until they can replicate the exact composition. Then there are the watermarks. These translucent images embedded in the paper are visible when held up to light. Creating convincing watermarks requires manufacturing the paper itself with varying thickness. It's not something you can add after the fact. The entire paper-making process has to be perfected. The ink is another puzzle. British banknotes use specialized inks that react in specific ways to light and chemical testing. The prisoners conduct hundreds of experiments, mixing compounds, testing reactions, trying to match not just the color but the chemical signature. But here's where the story takes a turn that explains why this 80-year-old operation still matters today. As the prisoners work, they discover something the British themselves might not have fully appreciated. They discover that security through complexity creates its own vulnerabilities. Let me explain. The Bank of England had layered security feature upon security feature over the decades. Each governor, each security committee had added new protections, finer engravings, more complex patterns, special serial number fonts, chemical treatments in the paper. All of these made the notes harder to counterfeit. But they also created something else. They created a system so complex that even the people printing legitimate notes couldn't always be sure they'd gotten every detail perfect. The prisoners, working with German intelligence, obtained samples of British pounds from various sources, pounds captured from spies, pounds seized in occupied territories, pounds obtained through neutral countries. And here's what they noticed. There were variations. Not major variations, but small inconsistencies. A serial number font that was slightly different on notes from different printing runs. Watermarks that were positioned fractionally differently. Ink that had aged at different rates. These variations existed because the legitimate system was so complex that absolute consistency was nearly impossible. And this is the flaw. This is the forgotten vulnerability that still catches criminals today. The forgers realized they didn't need to create perfect British pounds. They needed to create pounds that fell within the range of natural variation that existed in legitimate currency. As long as their counterfeits matched some real pounds closely enough, the small differences would be attributed to normal variation in the printing process. It's like trying to catch someone wearing a disguise in a crowd where everyone looks slightly different. If your disguise makes you look like you could plausibly be any one of 1,000 real people, you're effectively invisible. By late 1943, the operation is producing pounds that are, for all practical purposes, undetectable. Even British banks, with access to genuine notes for comparison, can't reliably identify the counterfeits. The German operation has successfully reverse-engineered one of the world's most secure currencies. The prisoners are now producing millions of pounds. The notes are perfect down to the smallest detail. The serial numbers follow the Bank of England's own numbering systems. The signatures are indistinguishable from those of actual bank officials. Even the aging of the paper is artificially replicated, so fresh counterfeits look like they've been in circulation for years. The Reich leadership now has a decision to make. Do they flood Britain with these notes, potentially destabilizing the British economy, but also potentially revealing their capability? Do they use the notes for espionage, to fund spy networks and sabotage operations? In the end, they do both, but with less impact than they'd hoped. Some notes are dropped over Britain by aircraft, but not in quantities large enough to cause economic chaos. Many more are used to fund German intelligence operations worldwide. Nazi spies from Portugal to Turkey to South America are funded with perfect British pounds. Here's an irony that the Reich leadership never fully appreciated. By making the notes too perfect, by putting so much effort into replicating every security feature, they actually limited their own operations' strategic impact. Think about it. If they had produced obviously fake notes and distributed them widely, it would have created panic. People would have questioned every pound note they received. Commerce would have slowed as verification became necessary for every transaction. Even if the counterfeits were easily detected, the chaos and loss of confidence could have been devastating. But because the notes were essentially undetectable, they simply became part of the money supply. They funded German operations, yes, but they didn't create the economic crisis that was the original goal. The prisoners, meanwhile, are living in a strange state of suspended danger. They know that the moment they're no longer useful, their protection evaporates. Some deliberately introduce small errors into their work, subtle enough not to be noticed, but enough to maintain the impression that perfection hasn't quite been achieved yet. It's a desperate gambit for survival. If we're always on the verge of success but never quite there, the thinking goes, they'll keep us alive to complete the work. As the war turns against Germany, the operation's priorities shift. They begin counterfeiting American dollars as well. The same meticulous process begins again. Study the paper, replicate the inks, perfect the engravings. But time is running out. By early 1945, Soviet forces are approaching from the east, American and British forces from the west. The Reich is collapsing. Kruger receives orders that chill him. End the operation. Eliminate the evidence. The prisoners understand what this means. They're evidence. But in the chaos of the Reich's collapse, orders become suggestions, and survival becomes the only imperative. Kruger, to his credit, makes a decision that will save lives. Instead of following orders to eliminate the prisoners, he leads them on a forced march south toward the Alps, away from the rapidly approaching front lines. It's a nightmarish journey. The prisoners, already weakened by years of captivity, march through the winter cold. Some don't make it, but many do, and when they're finally liberated by American forces in May 1945, their story begins to emerge. The Allies are stunned. Millions upon millions of essentially perfect British pounds and American dollars are discovered. The printing plates, the special paper, the formulated inks, all the apparatus of the most successful counterfeiting operation in history. The Bank of England faces a crisis. How many of these notes are in circulation? How can they identify them if their own experts can't tell them apart from legitimate currency? The solution they develop is brilliant and represents the birth of modern currency security philosophy. Instead of trying to find the counterfeits already in circulation, they change the currency itself. New designs, new security features, but most importantly, features designed with a different philosophy. Instead of adding layer upon layer of complexity that created natural variation, they focus on features that can be absolutely consistent. They develop inks that react to ultraviolet light in ways that are extremely difficult to replicate. They create paper with embedded security threads that can't be added after the fact. They design features that are binary, present or absent, with no middle ground. This is the fundamental security principle that emerged from Operation Bernhard, and it's the one that still catches modern criminals. Security that relies on complexity alone will eventually be defeated by patience and resources. But security that creates clear binary verification points, things that are either right or wrong with no gray area, that's far more resilient. Now, let's jump forward 80 years. Let's return to that criminal network I mentioned at the beginning, and dozens like them across the decades since the war. These modern counterfeiters study Operation Bernhard. They read the historical accounts. They learn about the meticulous attention to detail. They see how the Nazi forgers successfully replicated what was, at the time, considered and impossible to counterfeit currency. And they make a critical mistake. They assume that because the 1940s forgers succeeded through patience and attention to detail, they can do the same with modern currency. What they fail to understand is that the security landscape has fundamentally changed. The lessons learned from Operation Bernhard led to a complete rethinking of currency security. Modern banknotes include features that simply cannot be replicated without access to proprietary technologies. Color-shifting inks that contain metallic compounds in exact proportions, manufactured using processes that are themselves trade secrets. Holograms created with laser systems that cost millions of dollars. Microprinting so fine that it requires electron microscopy to fully examine, but more than that, modern security relies on features that have no tolerance for variation. Either the hologram shifts colors in exactly the right way, or it doesn't. Either the security thread is in exactly the right position and glows the right color under UV light, or it doesn't. There's no middle ground, no range of natural variation to hide within. The criminal network from 2023 learned this the hard way. They'd studied Operation Bernhard. They'd acquired high-quality printing equipment. They'd analyzed genuine banknotes. They'd even recruited individuals with printing and chemistry expertise. Their counterfeit euros looked excellent. To the casual eye, even to many merchants, they seemed perfect. They'd replicated the paper texture, the basic printing, the visible security features. But they'd fallen into the same trap as dozens of criminal operations before them. They'd focused on replicating complexity without understanding the binary nature of modern security features. When their notes were examined with a standard UV light, the kind that any bank teller has access to, the security features didn't just look slightly different. They were completely absent. The special inks they couldn't replicate simply showed nothing under UV examination. It was like creating a perfect fake diamond that doesn't sparkle. You can match the shape, the weight, even the color. But the fundamental property that makes a diamond what it is, you can't fake without essentially creating a real diamond. Law enforcement agencies, particularly Europol and Interpol, have entire divisions that study counterfeiting operations. They've noticed a pattern. Criminal networks that study historical counterfeiting operations, particularly Operation Bernhard, tend to overestimate their chances of success. There's a psychological phenomenon at play. I'll call it the historian's fallacy. Because these criminals know that perfect counterfeits were once produced, they believe perfect counterfeits can still be produced. They don't fully internalize how fundamentally the security paradigm has shifted. It's similar to how knowing that people once sailed across oceans in wooden ships doesn't mean you can do it now with the same ease. The ocean hasn't changed, but everything else has. Let me tell you about another case, this one from 2018. A group operating in South America obtained industrial printing equipment worth over $2 million. They spent years preparing. They analyzed U.S. $100 bills with equipment that would have seemed like science fiction to the Operation Bernhard forgers. They successfully replicated many features, the color-shifting ink, or at least something that looked similar, the watermarks, the security thread. Their notes could fool currency-counting machines in some cases, but they made one small error, one tiny oversight. The microprinting, those impossibly tiny letters that say USA and 100 repeated in what looks like a solid line to the naked eye, they got it 99% correct. 99%. In the world of modern currency security, 99% might as well be 0%. Because here's what they didn't understand. Those micro-printed features aren't just there to be difficult to replicate. They're there to create a clear threshold. Either you have access to the exact printing technology used by the legitimate mint, or you don't. Either your microprinting is absolutely perfect, or it's obviously wrong when examined with magnification. There's no middle ground, no range of natural variation to hide in. That was the lesson learned from Operation Bernhard. And it's the trap that keeps catching criminals 80 years later. When forensic examiners looked at their notes under magnification, the micro-printing, instead of being crisp, clear letters, was a blur of ink. Close, but not close enough. Binary failure. Every member of that operation was tracked down within a year. The very features they thought they'd successfully replicated were the ones that marked their notes as obviously counterfeit to anyone with basic examination tools. Now you might wonder, with all this technology, all these security features, do counterfeiters still try? Absolutely. But the nature of counterfeiting has changed in ways that prove the success of the post-Bernhard security philosophy. Modern counterfeiters, the ones who aren't caught immediately, don't try to create perfect replicas anymore. That game is essentially over. Instead, they create what are called adequate counterfeits, notes that will fool a busy cashier in poor lighting, that will pass through an automated system that checks only one or two features. They succeed not by perfection, but by exploiting gaps in verification. A store that doesn't check large bills carefully, a currency exchange that relies on outdated detection equipment. These operations succeed through volume and speed, passing hundreds of mediocre counterfeits before anyone notices, rather than through the quality and patience approach of Operation Bernhard. But even these operations face a problem that didn't exist in the 1940s. Modern currency has serial numbers that are tracked digitally. Large transactions are recorded. The path of high-denomination notes through the financial system can be traced. When a counterfeit is discovered, investigators can often track backward to find when and where it entered circulation. This creates a data trail that leads back to the source far more reliably than was ever possible in the past. There's a case from 2021 that illustrates this perfectly. Counterfeit 50-pound notes started appearing in Scotland. They were mediocre quality, easily detected by anyone who bothered to check, but they were being passed in small shops, tourist areas, places where verification was lax. Over 6 months, about 50,000 pounds worth of these counterfeits entered circulation. The operation seemed almost sustainable. Keep the quality just barely adequate, target places with poor verification, move around so no single location sees too many fake notes. But modern currency tracking systems created a pattern. Every single one of these notes, when eventually detected and reported, could be traced to clusters of initial appearances. The data analysis revealed not just where the notes were being passed, but could predict with surprising accuracy where the next ones would appear. Law enforcement set up targeted operations in predicted locations. Within 3 weeks of shifting to this data-driven approach, they'd arrested the individuals passing the notes, tracked back to the production facility, and dismantled the entire operation. The counterfeits themselves, the physical notes, were almost irrelevant to the investigation. The data trail they created was what ended the operation. This is the modern evolution of the lesson from Operation Bernhard. Security isn't just in the object itself anymore. It's in the systems that track, verify, and analyze. You can't hide in the variation because the variation itself is now data that reveals patterns. Let me share something that I find particularly fascinating. Some of the world's top currency security experts, the people who design the features that protect euros, dollars, pounds, yen, they study Operation Bernhard not as an example of how to counterfeit, but as an example of how to think about security. They ask themselves, if we were the ones trying to counterfeit our own currency, how would we do it? What would we exploit? Where are the weaknesses? This adversarial thinking, imagining yourself as the attacker, comes directly from analyzing historical operations like Bernhard. The Nazi forgers succeeded because they thought, like the Bank of England, understood the system from the inside, found the weaknesses in that very understanding. Modern security designers do the same thing, but use that insight to create systems that are resistant to that exact type of analysis. Features that can't be reverse engineered because they rely on physical properties or manufacturing processes that can't be replicated outside of specialized facilities. There's a particular security feature, I won't name which currencies use it or what exactly it is, that even if I explained in complete detail how it works, you still couldn't replicate it. Not because the knowledge is secret, but because the equipment required to implement it exists in only a handful of facilities worldwide, costs hundreds of millions of dollars, and requires materials that are themselves tightly controlled. That's the ultimate evolution of the lesson learned from Operation Bernhard. Security that isn't dependent on secrecy alone, but on practical impossibility. Now, I want to address something important. I've talked a lot about how criminals are caught, how security has evolved. But there's a human element to this story that's crucial to understand. Remember those prisoners in Sachsenhausen? The ones forced to use their skills to help the regime that was trying to destroy them? After the war, they faced complicated reactions from their own communities. Some were hailed as survivors who did what they had to do. Others faced whispered accusations. Did they cooperate too willingly? Did they contribute to funding the Nazi war machine? Adolf Burger, one of the survivors, spent decades telling his story, writing books, giving testimony. He wanted people to understand the impossible choices faced by those in the camps. He also wanted to document the technical details of the operation, partly for historical record, partly as a warning. His message was clear. The same skills and technologies that can protect society can also be turned against it. The difference isn't in the tools themselves, but in the systems and values that govern their use. This brings us to a modern parallel that's both troubling and instructive. Today's criminals who study Operation Bernhard often miss this deeper lesson. They see the technical achievement, the successful counterfeiting, and think that's the important part. They don't see the moral framework, the human cost, the fact that the operation ultimately failed in its strategic objectives, and that its very success led to security innovations that made future operations vastly more difficult. It's like studying a bank robbery and focusing only on how the thieves got into the vault, while ignoring that they were all caught imprisoned and that the bank upgraded its security systems specifically because of that robbery. In the past decade, there have been at least 15 major counterfeiting operations dismantled across Europe, North America, and Asia that explicitly used Operation Bernhard as a blueprint. Every single one was caught, every single one. The pattern is almost formulaic at this point. A criminal network forms, often including individuals with printing or artistic skills. They acquire historical materials about Operation Bernhard. They convince themselves that with modern technology, they can succeed where even the well-funded Nazi operation ultimately fell short. They spend months or years preparing, acquiring equipment, studying genuine currency, producing test notes. They achieve what they believe is success, notes that look perfect to their eyes. They begin distribution, usually starting small, testing the waters, and within weeks or months, they're under surveillance. Within a year, they're in custody. The security systems designed in response to Operation Bernhard catch them, not despite their study of that historical operation, but because of it. They're following a playbook that the security establishment has had 80 years to counter. It's like trying to use a battle strategy from the Civil War in modern warfare. The fundamental approaches might have been brilliant for their time, but the entire context has evolved beyond recognition. Here's something even more interesting. Some of these modern criminal networks have included members who genuinely believed they were being innovative, that they had found new approaches that weren't dependent on the Operation Bernhard methodology. But when security services analyze their methods after arrest, the same patterns emerge. Focus on replicating visible complexity rather than understanding binary security features. Assumption that patience and attention to detail are sufficient. Failure to appreciate the systemic nature of modern security. These aren't conscious choices to follow the Bernhard template. They're the natural result of approaching the problem without fully understanding how fundamentally the landscape has changed. There is a researcher at the Bank for International Settlements who studies counterfeiting trends. She's published papers on what she calls generational security paradigms. Her thesis is that major counterfeiting successes fundamentally reshape security for the next generation, creating what amounts to an immune response. Operation Bernhard was exactly such an event. It proved that complexity without clarity creates vulnerability. The response was to build clarity into security at a fundamental level. But here's where it gets really interesting. She predicts that we're approaching another such generational shift, driven not by a successful counterfeiting operation, but by the emergence of quantum computing and advanced artificial intelligence. These technologies might eventually be able to analyze and replicate physical security features in ways that are currently impossible. A quantum computer might be able to simulate the exact molecular structure needed for certain security inks. AI might be able to control manufacturing processes with precision that matches or exceeds the specialized facilities that currently produce security features. In other words, we might be approaching a time when the binary security features that emerged from the lessons of Operation Bernhard could themselves become vulnerable. But here's the thing. Security designers aren't waiting for this to happen. They're already developing what are being called quantum-resistant security features, not just for digital cryptography, but for physical currency as well. These include features based on quantum mechanical properties that literally cannot be copied because the act of measurement changes the state of the system. Features that use biological markers, DNA sequences engineered specifically for currency security. Features that exist at the intersection of physical and digital, where the node itself is just part of a larger verification system. It's an arms race, and it always will be. But it's an arms race where one side has all the advantages. The legitimate currency producers can innovate openly, pool resources internationally, and implement changes across the entire financial system. Counterfeiters have to work in secret with limited resources, always reactive rather than proactive. And they carry the burden of history, specifically the history of Operation Bernhard and the security revolution it triggered. Every time a new criminal operation begins, convinced they've found an angle, convinced that their technical skills will be enough, they're fighting not just against current security, but against 80 years of accumulated defensive innovation. Let me give you one final example that ties all this together. In 2022, an international task force dismantled what they initially thought was a sophisticated counterfeiting ring. But as they dug deeper, they realized it was something more interesting. It was a training operation. A group was recruiting individuals with technical skills, teaching them about historical counterfeiting operations, particularly Operation Bernhard, and then doing nothing. Not actually producing counterfeit currency. At first, investigators were baffled. What was the point? Then they realized it was a long-term recruitment and radicalization pipeline. The counterfeiting training was a cover for building a network of technically skilled individuals loyal to a particular ideology. The counterfeiting itself was never the goal. It was a tool for identification and recruitment. Who has the skills we need? Who's willing to cross legal lines? Who can maintain operational security? By positioning it as a study of historical operations, particularly Operation Bernhard with its connection to World War II, they could attract a particular type of individual while maintaining plausible deniability. We're just history enthusiasts, learning about fascinating technical achievements. The task force's discovery of this operation led to a rethinking of how counterfeiting investigations are approached. They're no longer just about protecting currency. They're about understanding the networks, the ideologies, the long-term intentions of organized criminal groups. And once again, Operation Bernhard is at the center not because the operation itself is particularly relevant to modern counterfeiting, but because it's become a symbol, a touchstone, a shared reference point that criminals use to identify each other and establish credibility. Security services now monitor for interest patterns, groups or individuals who suddenly start researching Operation Bernhard in unusual detail, not because research itself is suspicious, but because combined with other indicators, it can signal the formation of a counterfeiting operation. There are algorithmic systems that flag these patterns, that identify when someone's internet search history or library records suggest they're moving from casual interest to operational planning. This is the panopticon that modern criminals can't escape. Even their preparation, even their research, creates data trails that sophisticated analysis can detect. The prisoners of Sachsenhausen, working with primitive equipment by today's standards, had no such data trails to worry about. The knowledge they gained, the techniques they developed, existed only in their minds and in the physical objects they created. Today, every search, every purchase of equipment, every consultation with a technical expert, every test print creates data. And that data, aggregated and analyzed, paints a picture that's often clearer than any single piece of evidence could provide. So when I say that Operation Bernhard still deceives today's criminals, I mean it in multiple ways. It deceives them into thinking that technical skill alone is sufficient. It deceives them into believing that historical success implies future possibility. It deceives them into following patterns that security services have long since learned to recognize. But perhaps most fundamentally, it deceives them about the nature of modern security itself. They see the complexity of a modern banknote and think, like the Nazi forgers, that complexity can be reverse-engineered through patience and skill. What they don't see is that the complexity is deliberately designed to be unreachable, not just difficult, but practically impossible to replicate without access to resources and technologies that are themselves controlled and monitored. It's a beautiful irony. The most successful counterfeiting operation in history has become the blueprint for how not to approach modern counterfeiting. Every criminal who studies it and thinks they can replicate its success is following a path that leads directly to failure. The security establishment doesn't try to suppress information about Operation Bernhard. They don't classify the historical documents or hide the technical details. Why would they? Every criminal who bases their approach on what worked 80 years ago is making their job easier. It's the ultimate honey trap. Here's a detailed account of a successful counterfeiting operation. Study it carefully, learn from it, base your entire approach on it, and then watch as every single assumption you've made proves obsolete in the face of modern security. As we come to the end of this story, I want you to consider one final thought. The lessons of Operation Bernhard aren't just about currency or security. They're about how we think about systems, about complexity, about the relationship between past and present. In every field, from cybersecurity to medicine to social organization, there are equivalents to Operation Bernhard. Historical successes that people study and try to replicate, not realizing that the very success of those historical efforts led to systemic changes that make replication impossible. The criminal who studies Operation Bernhard and thinks they can counterfeit modern currency is making the same mistake as the general who studies ancient battle tactics and thinks they apply to modern warfare, or the disease that tries to infect a population that's been vaccinated specifically against it. Success breeds adaptation, and adaptation, when it's systematic and well-resourced, creates environments where the old paths to success become paths to certain failure. The prisoners of Sachsenhausen, working under the most horrible conditions imaginable, created something remarkable: perfect copies of British pounds, a technical achievement that, in its time, seemed to prove that no security system was truly unbreakable. But their very success triggered changes that have made currency more secure than at any point in human history. The lessons learned from their work, forced though it was, have protected countless people from fraud and economic disruption. And the criminals who study their achievement, who dream of matching it, who think that dedication and skill will be enough, they're the ones deceived by history, trapped by success that can never be repeated, chasing a victory that's been impossible for 80 years and becomes more impossible every day. That is the forgotten security flaw of World War II. Not a weakness that still exists and can be exploited, but a lesson so thoroughly learned and so completely addressed that the very attempt to exploit it has become the mark of someone who doesn't understand the first thing about modern security. Operation Bernhard was the last great success of traditional counterfeiting. Everything that came after has been a footnote, a failed attempt to recapture something that can never exist again. And every criminal who believes they're following in the footsteps of a historical success is actually following a trail of breadcrumbs deliberately left by those who learned from that success and made absolutely certain it could never happen again. The prisoners survived, most of them anyway. They told their stories. The world listened. And from their ordeal came security principles that continue to protect us 80 years later, often in ways we don't even realize. The next time you hold a banknote, any banknote from any modern currency, remember that its security features are a direct legacy of those forced laborers in Sachsenhausen. Their unwilling contribution to one of history's greatest counterfeiting operations led to innovations that make our economic system more trustworthy and more resilient. And the next time you hear about a counterfeiting operation being shut down, remember that there's a good chance the criminals thought they were being clever, thought they'd learned from history, thought that studying the masters of the past would give them an edge. They were deceived, not by lies, but by truth. The truth that the world had changed, that security had evolved, that the same methods that once succeeded were now the very definition of failure. Operation Bernhard remains fascinating not because it shows us how to break security systems, but because it shows us how one successful attack can reshape defense for generations. It's a testament to human ingenuity, both in the creation of the counterfeits and in the response that made sure nothing like it could succeed again. And somewhere right now, there's probably someone reading about Operation Bernhard, studying the techniques, admiring the achievement, and thinking, I could do that today. They're already caught. They just don't know it yet, because the security flaw they think they've found was closed before they were born, and the very fact that they're looking for it marks them as someone who doesn't understand the game they're trying to play. That's the true legacy of Operation Bernhard, not in what it achieved, but in what it taught us, and in how that teaching continues to protect us, decade after decade, by deceiving those who think that past success is a blueprint for future victory. The war ended 80 years ago. The operation failed in its strategic objectives. The prisoners were freed, but the lessons learned that day continue to echo through every banknote, every security feature, every criminal investigation into counterfeiting. A forgotten flaw that isn't really forgotten at all, but rather so thoroughly addressed that trying to exploit it has become the mark of someone who has already lost. And that might be the most perfect security system of all, one where the very attempt to break it is the thing that guarantees failure, where studying the past success leads not to replication, but to repetition of a pattern that everyone is now watching for, where the historical blueprint has become a map directly to prison. Operation Bernhard was the last hurrah of an era. Modern criminals who don't realize that era has ended will continue to be caught year after year, decade after decade, all following the same path, all making the same mistakes, all deceived by a forgotten flaw that everyone except them remembers all too well.